For over 60 years, I did everything right. I ate the bread my mother told me was wholesome. I used the oils that came in pretty bottles with words like light and pure printed on the label. I treated myself to sweet rolls on Sunday mornings because I had earned them, because life is short, and because that is what good living looked like in my neighborhood, in my kitchen, in my time. I was not careless. I was not ignorant. I was doing exactly what I had been taught. And for over 60 years, my knees were slowly drowning. I did not know that. I want to be clear about that because I am not here to make anyone feel ashamed. I did not know that the food I was most proud of, the food I considered my small, daily act of self-care, was feeding something I could not see. It was feeding the fire inside my joints. Every morning, every meal, every little reward I gave myself was adding kindling to a fire I did not know was burning. I was not feeding myself. I was feeding my pain. And nobody told me. Not my doctor at the time, not the nutritionist I saw twice in my 70s, not the labels on the food. Nobody said a word. I am 92 years old now. My knees do not ache the way they used to. My hands work. I walked to the end of my street and back this morning without stopping to hold a wall. And I think about all the years before that, the years when getting out of a chair felt like climbing a small mountain. And I wonder how many of those years I could have had differently. That thought has a little sting to it, but I would rather feel that sting and tell you what I learned than stay quiet and let you repeat my mistakes. So let me tell you what I threw away, and let me tell you what I put in its place. The first thing I threw away was white bread. Now, I know that sounds almost too simple. White bread, American as apple pie, as the saying goes. I had eaten it my entire life. Soft sandwich bread, dinner rolls, the kind of toast that turns perfectly golden and smells like childhood. I loved it, genuinely. But here is what nobody explained to me. White bread behaves inside your body almost exactly like sugar. The moment it hits your digestion, it spikes your blood, and that spike triggers a response that is essentially your body preparing for a fight that never comes. That response, that constant state of low-level alarm, is what I now picture as rust settling into the joints. Not all at once, slowly, the way a hinge on a garden gate starts to stiffen after a few rainy seasons. You do not notice it happening. You just notice one day that the gate is hard to open. I ate that rust maker every single day for 6 decades. The second thing I threw away was the refined vegetable oils, the corn oil, the generic vegetable blend in the big plastic jug. I cooked with them because they were cheap and because they had no flavor, which I had been told meant they were neutral, harmless. But they are not harmless. These oils, when they are processed the way they are processed, create something in the body that is like a slow flood inside the blood vessels. Imagine your arteries as garden hoses. Now imagine someone slowly, imperceptibly narrowing those hoses from the inside, coating the walls with something sticky and resistant. That is what those oils were doing. And the joints, which depend on good blood flow the way a houseplant depends on water, were getting less and less of what they needed. The fluid that should have been lubricating my knees was getting stingier. The cartilage was getting thirsty, and I kept pouring that oil into my pan every morning, thinking I was being practical. Doctors do not often talk about this, which still amazes me. When I went in with knee pain in my early 70s, nobody asked me what oil I cooked with. Nobody asked me what kind of bread was on my table. They looked at my x-rays, they talked about age, they gave me something for the inflammation. They treated the fire. Nobody asked what I was using for fuel. The third thing I threw away were the sweet pastries. Not because sugar is some great villain in isolation, but because I was eating them in a way that set off the worst possible chain of events in my body first thing in the morning. On an empty stomach, that much sugar is essentially a torch to dry wood, and I was doing this consistently, ritually, lovingly. Sundae rolls, little cakes from the bakery down the street, the kind of thing you associate with warmth and family and reward. Those associations are not wrong. Food carries love, but I was using a flamethrower when I needed a candle. Now, here's the part people sometimes push back on. And I understand why. Because giving up these things sounds like giving up pleasure, sounds like the end of something. I want to be honest with you. At first, it did feel that way. There is a grief in changing how you eat that nobody prepares you for. I missed my toast. I missed the smell of Sunday mornings. I had to find new rituals, and that took time. But let me tell you what I put in its place, because this is where the story changes. I started every morning with a glass of warm water and a full tablespoon of extra virgin olive oil, the real kind, from a bottle that smells almost grassy and peppery when you open it. Just that before anything else on an empty stomach. It felt strange at first, almost medicinal, but within a few weeks, I began to notice that my digestion was calmer, and something I can only describe as a very faint morning stiffness in my fingers was quietly retreating. I do not know exactly how to explain what olive oil does inside the body in simple terms, but I think of it as a gentle polish on all the surfaces that had been growing rough. It coats things, it smooths things. It tells the body, in some language the body understands, that it does not need to be on guard. I replaced my white bread with bread made from whole rye or sprouted grains, the dense kind, the kind that takes a moment to chew. It does not spike the blood the way white bread does. It moves through the body more slowly, more steadily, like a slow river rather than a flash flood. The joints, I believe, feel the difference in that steadiness. I started eating oily fish 3 times a week. Sardines, salmon, mackerel. Not fancy preparations, just the fish, with a little lemon, sometimes with a salad. The fat in those fish does something remarkable for inflammation. I think of it as water poured gently onto the fire that used to burn in my knees. Not a dramatic extinguishing, a slow, patient cooling, over months, not days. I added a small handful of walnuts every afternoon, around 3 o'clock, when my energy used to dip and I used to reach for something sweet. Just walnuts, maybe 10 or 12 of them. It takes some getting used to, choosing a handful of walnuts over a cookie. But your body, given enough time, stops craving the cookie with the same urgency. That urgency fades. I was surprised by that. I did not expect it to fade. Before dinner, or sometimes with dinner, I started having a small bowl of something fermented, sauerkraut, or plain yogurt without any sweetener, sometimes a few tablespoons of a good kimchi. I had always been slightly skeptical of the idea that what happens in your gut could affect your joints. It seemed like too long a distance, too indirect a connection, but I now believe it completely, because I felt the difference myself. The fermented foods seemed to quiet something systemic, something I had not even noticed was noisy until it became quieter. And before bed, every night, I had a cup of warm turmeric milk. A cup of whole milk, not skim, heated gently, with half a teaspoon of turmeric and a pinch of black pepper and just the faintest trace of honey. That is all. It became my signal to the day that it was ending. Something warm, something slightly golden, something that felt like it was doing quiet work while I slept. Now let me tell you what happened. After the first month, I noticed that getting out of bed in the morning was taking less effort. Not dramatically less, but the first few steps across the bedroom floor, which had been the hardest steps of my day for years, were slightly easier. I mentioned it to my daughter, and she told me I was probably just having a good stretch of weather. Maybe. But the weather changed, and the feeling stayed. By the third month, I was able to walk to the end of my block and back without my knees swelling afterward. That had not been possible for years. I remember the specific afternoon I did it because I stood at the end of my street and felt something I can only call disbelief. I had not done anything heroic. I had changed what was on my plate, and my knees were responding like something inside them had been given permission to heal. By the end of the first year, I was not pain-free. I want to be honest about that. I am 92 years old, and I have decades of wear in these joints. But the quality of the pain had changed. It was duller, less insistent, less like a voice shouting, and more like a voice that had learned to whisper. There were full days when I did not think about my knees at all, and I had not had those days in a very long time. Doctors do not always believe patients when they describe these gradual, qualitative shifts in pain. I find that troubling because this kind of slow improvement, the kind that does not show dramatically on an X-ray, is still real. It is still life. It still matters. I also want to tell you about the ritual I made for myself at the end of each day, because I think the body needs rituals, the way it needs food. After my turmeric milk, before I got into bed, I started doing two things that I now consider non-negotiable. The first was a warm compress on my knees, just a towel soaked in warm water, wrung out until it was damp and holding heat. I would lay it across both knees and sit quietly for 10 minutes. The warmth draws blood to the surface, brings circulation to tissue that spends most of the day being compressed and pressured. I thought of it as a kind of invitation to the body, a slow, wordless invitation for healing to come to that place. Those 10 minutes became something I genuinely looked forward to, a pause, a kindness to myself after a long day of being upright and moving and asking my joints to carry me. The second was a simple stretch. I would sit on the edge of my bed and slowly straighten each leg, hold it fully extended for a count of 10, then lower it gently. Just 5 repetitions on each side. Nothing strenuous, nothing that required athleticism or special equipment or a trainer standing over me. Just the quiet act of moving the joint through its range while it was warm and relaxed and ready. My physical therapist, when I described this to her, said it was one of the most sensible things she had heard from a patient my age. She said most people either do nothing or try to do too much. The 10-minute warmth, followed by gentle movement in the evening, is the kind of thing that costs nothing and gives a great deal back. I sometimes wonder why this combination is not simply told to every person who walks into a clinic with joint pain. It seems so obvious now. Doctors do not mention it nearly enough. So now I ask you to think about your own table for a moment, not with judgment, not with alarm, but just with curiosity. Is there white bread sitting in your bread box? Is there a jug of vegetable oil next to your stove? Is there something sweet that you eat every morning, faithfully? Because it feels like a small reward. Because it feels like love. Because it has been there your whole life. I am not saying any of those things make you careless. I ate all of them for 60 years, and I was a careful person who loved her family and paid attention to her health. I am saying that sometimes the most familiar things are the hardest to question. And sometimes the thing that is harming us is wrapped in the feeling of comfort so completely that we cannot see it for what it is. I changed my plate at 91. I want you to understand that number, 91. People told me, kindly, gently, that perhaps it was a little late to be making these kinds of changes. That at my age, the body is what it is. I did not accept that. I am glad I did not accept that, because my knees got better. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely, measurably, daily, better. And I think about all the people who are 50, or 60, or 70, who still have so many mornings ahead of them. And I feel an urgency to say, you have time. You have more time than I did. The table can change. I also think about my mother, who died with terrible joint pain and was told it was simply her fate, her age, her body wearing out. And I wonder, with a sadness I have carried for a long time, whether a different table might have given her easier mornings too. We will never know. That is the sting of learning something too late. But I carry the knowledge for her, in a way. I carry it forward. The question I come back to, the one that I think about when I walk to the end of my street now, is this. How much of what we call aging is actually damage that accumulated so slowly we mistook it for time? I do not know the full answer. I suspect nobody does entirely. But I know that some of what I spent 60 years calling the inevitable weight of getting older turned out to be something I was putting on my own plate, meal by meal, year by year, with the best intentions in the world. And I wonder, genuinely, whether that rings familiar to you.